Hi folks, welcome back. So here we have the proof of my earlier greed in making cuts when I first started doing distilling. I have 4 jars of spirit that I'd had aging, about the same volume as what's in this jar, and about the same volume again in little bottles that came from my experiments in forcing the chemical reactions to react faster that I was experimenting with recently. I put all of that except for this one jar, so effectively about the same volume as 4 of these. So I put all that back in the still and used all the experience that I've gained over the last year and a bit in terms of running the still with lower power so that it comes off cleaner, and taking finer cuts so that I actually only get the heart cut as opposed to having it tainted so much by being greedy and going into the heads and tails. Looking back at my earlier notes from the original distillation of these all-grain batches, I could see that the distillation runs follow a very similar pattern in terms of the temperatures that it goes through and the percent alcohol that comes off. And this gives me a guide as to roughly where I am through the run. And using that, I can then concentrate on the points where I know I'm going into the heart cut and where I'm coming out of the heart cut and going into the tails. And I use my senses of taste and smell at those critical points to try and narrow down and get the best heart cut that I can. For the heart cut, I now collect it all as one big batch. Once I've decided it's the beginning of the heart cut, that's it, it goes into a jar. I keep collecting until I'm confident that I've reached the end of the cut, and then I stop collecting in one big jar. Outside of that range, I collect in small jars still, so that if I'm a little inaccurate at the beginning or end of the heart cut, I have an opportunity to add in maybe a small amount of each one. So I collect in jars of about 100 to 200 millilitres in each jar outside of the main heart cut. Those small jars I leave for a couple of days so that they smooth off a little bit, and then I taste them and make a decision about whether I was actually accurate with my cuts or whether I can add in a little bit more from these jars just outside of my heart cut. In this particular case, I found that I'd started a little bit late with my heart cut, so the small jar immediately before this I added in afterwards. This collection of spirit resulted in a 64% alcohol by volume set of spirit, and has now been sitting on oak for a few days. Tasting it today, it's spicy and hot as you'd expect from something that's just come off the still, but it doesn't have any of the unpleasant flavours that I was struggling to remove out of this stuff that I've been aging for the last year or so. So this jar is the combined heads and tails that I took off on the same run that this heart came from, and as you can see, I've got far more heads and tails than I have heart cut, and I didn't even go very deep into the tails. Once I knew I'd definitely gone past about 40% coming off the still, I stopped collecting it, so it could have been a bit more if I'd bothered to keep the still running longer. But as you can see, despite the fact that all of this came from product that I'd already made cuts on to collect originally, there's a hell of a lot of heads and hearts that I've taken out of it, leaving me with this much cleaner heart cut. And when I tasted it, it has that sour note that I was struggling to get rid of from the original product that I collected. The reason I have a jar of this left is that I want to experiment with just how long, if ever, I can get this to age down to a product, and whether it'll actually remove those heads and tails taste that's in there. It may be that in another couple of years' time I'll be ditching this if it never comes up clean. And maybe it could be something that over a long time maturing actually becomes a nice complex whisky. We'll see. As you can see, all this heads and tails came from my greed during the original distilling. And from now on I'm going to be taking a much tighter heart cut, taking only about a quarter to a third of the output from the total run. And again, not bothering to go deep into the tails on any future runs. So what does that mean in terms of the potential output that I can get from a single batch of whisky that I ferment and distill? So I do my batches as 25 litres of fermentation. From that I'll end up with about 20 litres of cleared wash at about 10%. So that gives me a potential volume of alcohol in there of around about 2 litres out of that 20 litres of liquid. If we make the assumption that the final amount of alcohol comes off the still like this heart cut at 65% by volume, that 2 litres would be about 3 litres of product at 65% alcohol by volume. So a quarter to a third of that volume, which is what I expect to recover as a heart cut, will give me somewhere between 3/4 to a litre of heart cut from a typical batch run. And that's really where I was getting greedy. When you see this small amount come off the end of the still, when you've got all this other heads and tails, which is waste product almost, it's easy to get greedy and want to take some of that and include it in here. I think from now on, I have to be careful about making sure that I stick to a nice clean heart cut. If you recycle your heads and tails back into next run, I'd suggest not doing what I've done here, which is to dump it all into one jar. I'd suggest taking the small jars that were on either side of the heart cut, so maybe 1 or 2 jars before it and 1 or 2 jars after it, and only use those to recycle into the next batch. And that way you'll remove the very early heads and the very late tails from staying in there, and only take some of the cleaner stuff to recycle into the next batch, stuff that was close to being a heart anyway. So what has been the biggest difference today compared to the original distillations that I did? The main factor is turning down the power to the still. So rather than running to 2 kilowatts for a spirit run, I'm now only running at 1/2 kilowatt. Running it with lower power means that I increase my heart cut slightly because there's less mixing of the product at either end, and I can actually take a little bit more heart cut that's clean without having the heads or the tails mixing into it so much. This is the other thing that I've done. It's a bit of a personal choice really, to do with the style of whisky that I want to produce, which is a lighter style of whisky. So in Scotland that would come from stills that are very tall, so there's a lot of reflux available in those. So what I've got here is the copper dome for the T500, and also I've added some cooling around the beginning of the neck here. Both of these are to increase the amount of reflux that I get when the still is running, and to in that way try to emulate better the sort of spirit that I'd get from the lighter whiskies that I enjoy.